reason to buy one or two of the newspapers. Allow me to introduce my panel this morning. A little closer to me, I have Dr. Sam Kamau. He is a lecturer at the Aga Khan University. And of course, to my far left, I have Anthony Okonji. He is a communication expert. And later on, Milton Nyakundi, who is a veteran sports journalist, will be joining us on set. Remember, this is a Wednesday. And of course, it being a Wednesday, we get to put a spotlight on ourselves from around 7 to 7:30 as the fourth estate and say, are we doing well in terms of telling certain stories, the biggest stories of the week? That's a conversation at 7. But right now, I want to jump into press review. As I earlier promised, we'll take a look at the Standard newspaper. The biggest story we're running with, of course, is that speech. Well, I don't want to call it a speech because President Uhuru Kenyatta himself said that he couldn't read his speech out of embarrassment. Uhuru cabinet secretaries, top officials rather, have let me down. That's the president himself. And he goes on further to say that the president says many of the projects that were scheduled to begin a year ago are yet to take off despite funds being released. This is on page 6. So what are some of these funds? Allow me just to give you one or two examples so you might have an idea. Well, under the finance, that's the head of treasury, which is led by Henry Rotich himself. He says that to release money on time so government projects can be implemented. Of course, the Review Public Finance Act puts strict limits on importation of products that can produce locally, including fish. That's just one example, and that's one docket. Let me look for another docket. Yes, agriculture, led by CS Mwangi Kiunjuri, one of the dockets that has been on the news for quite a time right now. Improve security to tackle issues like cattle rustling. Improve quality of beef and milk, lower cost of production. So those are just some of the key points from President Uhuru Kenyatta's speech. If President Uhuru Kenyatta is not happy with his cabinet secretaries in terms of them failing to go to the ground, where does that leave Kenyans? So Dr. Sam, let me begin with you. You know, he was at Strathmore University. Yes. He couldn't even give his speech out of the embarrassment. And this, he said it himself, out of the embarrassment. Because cabinet secretaries that he personally elected, because we don't go vote for cabinet secretaries, have failed to deliver on projects that were supposed to start a year ago. Yet I think every single day we sing Big Four agenda. We might as well sing Big Four agenda till 2022 and nothing is being seen. What are your feelings towards this?
It's interesting that, you know, he made a public admission that some of his CSs have let him down. I'm not sure whether he's also passing the blame or the buck from himself because, again, he's the one who appointed them and bears the greatest responsibility. But at least it's a positive admission from him. He actually said he had a speech, but I think listening to the issues and the speech that he had from his handlers, he discovered there was a disconnect. And I think this is part of what we have been saying, or people have been saying, that some of the decisions and some of the policies, you know, in the recent past, especially remember the controversy around the finance bill and all that, there seems to be a disconnect between what Wanjiku and Mwananchi is saying and feeling and experiencing, and also now some of these speeches that are written by people, perhaps we just sit down and craft, you know, these speeches. Perhaps I can speculate what was in the speech was my government has set aside this money, my government has done, you know, we have allocated billions and all that. But when you listen to the experience, and perhaps this is what we want to get more of the voice of Wanjiku in terms of public participation, so that they get a better picture of the issues. But I want to say, if he thinks they have failed to deliver on the promises because he is last term, then he actually has the power to do something about it.
And that leads me to my next question. Anthony, here you are. Let's say you're an employer. If an employee is simply not delivering, fire him. Give him, even before even you get to fire him, give him 1 or 2 or 3, you know, notice, then do what is necessary. Don't you not think that's the same thing with President Uhuru Kenyatta? This is just an excuse. Again, these are people he has employed. We didn't go and vote for them. So it doesn't take you a minute or two to make a decision. If you've won your cabinet secretaries and you've been in leadership position for 5 years now, right? And this being your last term, I'm sure he has warned his cabinet secretaries. I'm sure he's had this conversation with them. Why are we still here?
I think with the president, on many occasions, politicians are known not to be honest. And I think yesterday, Uhuru Kenyatta was the most honest politician of the moment globally. And I say that because you can't go to a business school and lie to them about the success of business. They know, okay? And so why I call him honest is that he went and listened to the issues and he knew that his government had not delivered on a lot of promises, some of which he actually made at a similar event at Strathmore.
All right, Anthony, I'll come back to you so you can even give me further details on that. But there's something, Dr. Sam, you have mentioned, a disconnect between Wananchi and the higher leadership.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. But don't you not think that this also goes to show there's a disconnect in terms of leadership within the house itself, when you and your own boss are not seeing eye to eye, when you and your own boss are not working towards the same goal? Here you are, you've set a goal. Does your boss need to tell you what to do within the certain dockets? There's also a disconnect of leadership in itself, leave alone before we come to Wanjiko.
I would also say the president cannot micromanage everything. But you'll see, especially as head of state, many times he's brought in to come and launch, projects.
Right.
And, in terms of approving, when he chairs a cabinet meeting and they have approved certain projects and perhaps gone and launched them, then you'd expect that the people who are charged with that responsibility to go ahead and implement and provide reports. So when the president goes for such a function, for such an event, and I am sure he was very happy to talk about the money they had allocated 1 year back, the promises they have made, and then the response or the reports he's getting now coming to him is that actually these promises have not been kept. And these are simple things. Roads have not been done. It is basic infrastructure. It is, like he actually said that the traders, for example, were planning to we're planning to rebuild after the recent fire, and then all of a sudden the president realizes that the government promised and allocated some money, and this was not done. There was something else I also saw, I think, on KTN last night, where, there was also this controversy around water in Kajiado, where one of the CSs had gone to launch a project, and then all of a sudden discovered that the borehole does not have water, and a controversy around that. And these are some of the issues. Who is charged with the responsibility? And I would say the president, yes, being honest, he did a good thing. He actually apologized for the promises that have not been kept, but perhaps we need to see more action in terms of making sure that these promises, these commitments have been made, are actually being implemented. You
know what the sad part is that what you've just said right there, these are basic commodities, infrastructure, making sure that we improve our quality of beef and milk. This is 2018. These are things that we can honestly do and do very well. We're not here to build a spaceship that is going to go to Mars. Such simple projects. But then what Kenyans want to know is what next. Fine, President Uhuru Kenyatta was very honest. He said it himself, and I quote, "I came with a prepared speech, but after listening to you, I am so ashamed that I can't read it. I'll be lying to you if I read the contents of my speech. I am ashamed after the revelations made here." That's the president himself.
Allow me to add something to that. You see, the same issue, for example, it's almost 1 year since the president declared the Big Four as an agenda. I mean, as the focus of his government in the next couple of years, we would actually want to see now, some kind of tracking, so that we see, since the president launched and, declared that we'll focus on the Big Four, what has been achieved so far? Because I am sure, perhaps the reports he's been getting, and perhaps the disconnect we are talking about, is they could say, we have done this, we allocated this money. And you remember last year, the last time there was this thing that the government was very good in Kutenga and not Kutenda, So perhaps in terms of tracking to see, have we made any significant progress towards the Big Four that we are talking about? Or is it a good and nice concept that we've been preaching and we've been talking about, advocating for, but there's actually nothing happening? That is what we want to see. Do we have a monitoring system in place to make sure that you can provide timely reports that indicate this has been done, this has been achieved? Or are we going to wait for a couple of years and then all of a sudden the president says, the people I placed in charge of these things have let me down? That's
the thing. And one of the promises was also a lot to do with sports in terms of building stadiums. And that's just an example. Milton Nyakundi, he is a sports, a veteran sports journalist. He now joins us. And Nyakundi, here's the thing. Yes, here he was talking in terms of business, but even under the sports docket itself, which has been clouded by the Rio scandal, which we'll get to later on in details, simple promises like building stadiums cannot be accomplished. We are not seeing the fruits of it. And here's the thing, even though we are going to see a stadium, a lot of the other questions is the quality of these roads and the quality of these stadiums and so forth. What thoughts do you have to this specific scenario that happened yesterday with President Uhuru Kenyatta at Strathmore University?
To be very honest, I think 15 years ago when I entered the newsroom, we were talking about these promises that come through from government. Government is going to do this, going to do something else. But I see a president who's rightly frustrated because there is nothing that has happened. From a sports perspective, I think too much guesswork. The world is catching up with us, especially if you look at, for example, athletics. And this is something that I've talked about for a long time. When the rest of the world is investing in the technology, in the science of, getting things right. Our guesswork, finally, we are being caught. That is why, a few times you hear some American or some Russian has won an event that is traditionally perceived as a Kenyan event. Why? Because the raw talent that we pick from the Rift Valley, from Kisii, name it, in Nyanza, it's just raw talent. When the rest are investing in the science and technology of developing talent, of getting the infrastructure correct in terms of sports, when it is happening in the rest of the world, for us, we are still in the 19th century. And I'm sorry to say this, I think this government, just like previous governments, has done zero in terms of developing sports.
And here we are in 2018.
I can write a whole book about it.
Right.
It is zero.
You know what? This also leads me to talk about transparency. If the cabinet secretaries, and let's say they had 2-3 goals, simple 2-3 goals, build roads, produce proper milk and make sure that fertilizers within the country are the right kind, simple procedures. If transparency was key, these are things that these cabinet secretaries will be able to go tell President Kenyatta, this is where we've gotten to, this is where we seem to be struggling. And after 5 years, even 5 years is quite long, after 2 years, cabinet secretaries, you begin to see the work on the ground. That's the other question that comes to my mind, transparency within the cabinet secretaries and their dockets. Is it lacking?
Let's begin by, first of all, do we have the right people holding those positions, or do we have people getting rewarded for being political mercenaries or for having done this or that during the campaigns? That is where the problem begins. And I'll tell you, for the longest time, I've also had the occasion to interact with some of these people in cabinet. For example, I'll talk about sports, and a lot of times the guys get in there, the vetting process will happen, but the guys will get the jobs not because they understand, but because politically nobody is going to let down the president. And today the president speaks and says he is frustrated. Yet the same president makes sure that, for example, Jubilee, they have the majority. So when those names go to the National Assembly, they will just pass because, again, we have a legislature that is also not independent. They do not make their own decisions because, okay, boss amesema, so it will pass, the names will pass. The guys get in there, they have no clue whatsoever.
And that's the problem, Anthony, as a communication expert. This also goes on to show that I loved what Nyakundi has said. A lot of our cabinet secretaries are not chosen because they're professionals. You didn't choose a cabinet secretary under sports because this is someone who understands sports or someone who understands education, someone who understands foreign policy. It's all based on political reward. And that's where the heart of the problem begins.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear demonstration that corporate is not government. Corporate and government is very different. In corporate, heads would roll, but in government, it's a political agreement. And I think, just as was earlier being mentioned, Strathmore, the president has actually painted government into a corner. This is the same government that capped interest rates. So only allowed big-time borrowers to be able to get financing. Small-time traders actually suffered for that. And then without changing anything, what they've ended up doing is raising VAT on a couple of common commodities, which makes trading even more difficult. So to go out there to a business school and try to create an impression that there's actually been some successes scored would have been a very dishonest statement from the president. And I think he knew the environment in which he was operating in. And I would like to, from a communications point of view, thank him for the honesty in not being able to communicate what had been presented as a speech.
I would want to be fair, in condemning the cabinet and not say that it's all of them, because they are specifically those ones. He actually apportioned, blame and responsibility on specific ones. So while I will not dismiss the entire cabinet and say they are unqualified, those who are doing a good job, we would commend them. But these ones specifically that the president indicated they have let him down, then we would actually want to see what action he's going to put in place, because it is his own assessment that they actually are misleading him or they are not supporting his vision. Yeah.
Speaking of which, I want to bring your attention to another interesting story, which we have ran with DP Ruto fights state agency on Western, a 300 million value hotel. This is in regards to hotels and other buildings that are sitting on riparian land. So Ruto fights agency when it comes to Western Hotel. A lot of the question around here, let me read to you what his lawyer Ahmed Nasir Abdullahi on behalf of Deputy President William Ruto says, that no one has ever come to claim the property since he acquired it. And even during the hotel construction, he did not receive any complaints, whether from the state or any individual. You know, Anthony, this reminds me of one thing. Every person who has gone through this riparian says the same thing. I did not know. We had the proper documents. Never this, never that. It's the exact same thing. Does that mean that there should be a sort of favorism for Deputy President William Ruto when it comes to Western?
I think the mantra here would be ignorance of the law is no defense in court. You cannot go to court and say, I didn't know. That does not qualify it. And any time that you are acquiring any land, like in this kind of a situation, it is due process that you need to follow up. The government expects that you would follow up, even if it doesn't. That's the tragedy of it all. And then we have to also look at the question of a conflict of interest. This is actually the president of the Republic, the Vice President of the Republic of Kenya, who is in a contest with the government of Kenya over a property that was supposedly built on land that belongs to the government itself. It's quite a convoluted story, and we can know how this is going to go politically, but we also have to know that it will be very difficult sometimes for government to claim assets from members of government.
Nyakundi, before we go on break, I want to hear your thoughts. Who is to blame here? Because we're all saying that ignorance doesn't play well in court, but at the same time, Nema, give me papers, I build. Who is to blame in this whole riparian game? Well,
First of all, if you go back to the history of Weston and the land around it,
right.
It is a shame that the second highest office in the land, the holder is the one, in the thick of it. We saw some seeing characters come out and say they own the hotel, but today the story is coming out. And for me, let's not sugarcoat anything. It is just a shame that certain things are happening like they are. But what is important, Kenyans must claim what is rightfully theirs. And the unfortunate thing is that we have let mediocrity become a part of our system for so long, until when things are being done right, we actually think people are being hurt. But the law is the law. Let it cut whichever side, whoever it is, that is what Kenyans must demand.
All right, so Dr. Som, I don't want you to comment because we need to take a quick commercial break, and I know where that will go to. So allow us to take a break, but before we do that, grab a copy of the Daily Nation as well, especially if you're interested in matters education, how teachers will share exam billions. It's a big story. You want to make sure you grab a copy of that. Let's take a quick commercial break. When we come back, I return with the same panel, and we'll dive into newsroom. We get to put our spotlight on ourselves as journalists and the fourth estate and say, have we done justice this week in telling the biggest stories? We'd love to hear from you, so tweet us at KTN News, at Zinzi_K. We'll be right back.